This is on chapter 2, which is about psychological research. An interesting quote I found says that scientific research is a critical tool for successfully navigating our complex world. Without it, we would be forced to rely solely on intuition, other people's authority, and blind luck. And that's in your book on page 36. Any of the quotes that have a page number after them, by the way, can be found in your textbook. Other quotes I will provide the reference for. So as you know, and we've discussed previously, psychology, a big part of it is all about the connection between our thoughts, our behavior, and emotions, how those things are all interconnected. So when psychologists do research, this is primarily what they're looking at. It is worth noting that behavior is easily observed, but determining someone's thoughts and emotions requires a bit more creativity. So when you do research on someone's behavior, that's easy to see. But doing research on what someone thinks or what someone feels can be a little bit harder, as you can imagine. So what do psychologists do with the information? What do they do with what they find from their research? Most often it's used to determine the difference between a fact, which is a truth known by actual experience or observation, again, something known to be true, or an opinion, which is just a personal belief or judgment that is not founded on proof or certainty. In the scientific community, facts can be established only using evidence collected through empirical research. So just because I say it, or it's my opinion, doesn't make it a fact. It has to be proven through research, and that's why research is done. So how is research done? Probably most of you have heard of the scientific method. It's used very widely. It starts with just making an observation or asking a question. Then you do a little research on that area because there might have been previous experiments that have been done in that area. So you want to know if your observation or question is even valid. After doing the research, you're going to make a hypothesis, which is essentially just a guess at what the results will be. Then you do the actual experiment. You look at the data and you report your conclusions. But primarily, you report whether your hypothesis was correct or whether it appears to be incorrect. So let's look a bit further at what a hypothesis is. It's an educated guess as to what will happen during your experiment. The hypothesis is often written using the words if and then. For example, if I do not study, then I will fail the test. What makes a good hypothesis? I put in the little diagram over here, a solid question. Again, that's where your research comes in. And number 2 is background research. You want to make sure it's a solid question, that it's something you can do an experiment with and you can do research on. Number 3, making sure it's testable. Can you do an experiment with it? And you have to have an independent and dependent variable, which we'll discuss a little bit more in some later slides. So let's look a little further at what the experimental method is. There's several types of research methods, but first let's take a look at the experimental method. The experimental design means planning a set of procedures to investigate a relationship between variables. To design a controlled experiment, you need a testable hypothesis, which we already discussed that. You need a question that's a statement that's based on research that you know can be studied. You need at least one independent variable that can be precisely manipulated and at least one dependent variable that can be precisely measured. So let's look a little bit further at what independent and dependent variables are. An independent variable is the factor that the psychologist is manipulating in order to see if it has an effect on the dependent variable. The dependent variable, the psychologist wants to see if this factor is influenced by the independent variable. This includes an experimental and a control group. The experimental group is essentially the ones who will be experimented with. They're the ones that are going to be exposed to the independent variable. The control group is not going to be exposed to the independent variable. It is worth noting that participants should be randomly assigned to one of the groups. We'll discuss that a little bit later, but they should not know which group they're assigned to because that could affect the way they react. So let's look at an example from consumer psychology. I don't think your textbook talks about consumer psychology, so I included a definition here. It's the study of human behavior regarding their buying patterns, customs, and preferences in relation to consumer products, including their reactions and preferences to advertising, packaging, and marketing of those products. So essentially, it's someone who would probably work for a company and they would do marketing and decide what products someone wants and what's going to sell the best is consumer psychology. So the example, a consumer psychologist is trying to come up with an effective marketing technique for a new weight loss product. His thought is that showing before and after weight loss pictures is an effective marketing technique. And I'm sure you all have seen on social media and on TV the before and after pictures. Well, this person thinks that's going to be a good technique. People that see this are going to be more likely to buy the product. And that's his hypothesis. His hypothesis is that customers who are shown the before and after pictures will be more likely to purchase the product than those who are not shown the pictures. So, can you identify what the independent and dependent variables would be in this experiment? And I'll give you just a second to think about that before we move on. Okay, so the independent variable is the before and after pictures. That's what's being manipulated. The experimental group is shown the pictures and the control group is not. The experimental group are the ones being experimented on with the pictures. The dependent variable is whether or not the product is purchased. Remember that the psychologist has hypothesized that the experimental group, the ones that are shown the pictures, will be more likely to purchase the product. If the psychologist's hypothesis ends up being correct, then he can conclude that showing before and after pictures is an effective marketing technique for the weight loss product. So it's no longer just his opinion that showing before and after pictures will be effective. It becomes a sort of a fact. It's been proven through research that it is effective. When it comes to the experimental method, here are some other terms you should know. A single blind study is when participants do not know whether they're in the experimental or control group. If they do know, then it's going to cause the placebo effect, which means their expectations and beliefs are going to influence how they act. So if they know they're in an experimental group, they might act differently from knowing that they're in a control group. So they really shouldn't know which group they're in. A double-blind study means that neither the researcher or participants know which group they're in. This prevents experimenter bias, which is the possibility that a researcher's expectations might skew the results of the study. Reliability and validity are two other concepts related to the experimental method. Statistical analysis is the mathematical process by which researchers determine if there is a meaningful difference between control or experimental groups, or if the difference is just due to chance. Researchers want this difference to be reliable and valid. So in other words, the consumer psychologist wants to know, did the experimental group just by chance happen to buy more product, or is there really a difference when I show someone a before and after picture? You want those results to be reliable. In other words, the results can be reproduced over many studies. Many studies get the same result. Validity wants to make sure you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. If I'm trying to survey someone to see if they perhaps are depressed, I want to make sure my questions actually are assessing depression and not something else, so that it's a valid survey. So we looked at the experimental method. There are other research methods. One is the case study, where research is focused on one person or a small group. And even though it only focuses on one person or a small group, it can still allow for generalizing. And of course, generalizing refers to the ability to apply the findings to a larger segment of society. So even though I may just be looking at one class of daycare students, I can take that case study and apply it to a population of daycare students. Naturalistic observation, the goal of that research is to observe someone in their natural environment. It is important that the researcher is inconspicuous, because if someone knows they're being watched, this could affect their behavior, kind of similar to what we just talked about with a single blind study. You don't want to know you're being watched or that you're in an experiment, because that in itself could affect the way you act. A survey. Research focuses on a large group, unlike case studies, through the use of surveys or interviews, things like that. Still, like case studies, your results can be generalized to a larger segment of society. If possible, a random sample would be selected. A random sample means that everyone in the studied population has the same chance of being in the experimental or control group, or being a participant in the study. Archival research relies on looking at past records or data sets to look for interesting patterns or relationships. So perhaps if there has been research done on the same thing or similar things over time, you want to look and see, okay, did they get the same results? Did they get similar results? Longitudinal research, data gathering is administered repeatedly over an extended period of time. For example, the same group of people might be surveyed at age 15, at age 20, and 25. So the research, as it says, is longitudinal. It lasts for a long time. Cross-sectional research is similar, but instead of tracking the same group over time, you use a cross-section of the population is tracked. For example, a surveyor might interview a group of 15-year-old single females, a group of 25-year-old single females, and a group of 30-year-old single females. So instead of having to wait for those participants to age, you just interview groups of that age, so you can do it all at the same time. Correlational research is another type of research. Correlation refers to a statistical relationship between two variables, where a change in one variable is associated with a change in the other variable. It's important to remember that the presence of a correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Just because two variables are related to each other, in other words, doesn't mean that one causes the other. Again, correlational research includes two variables, but it only seeks to determine if there's a relationship between those variables, not if one causes the other. For example, a researcher might look to see if there's a relationship between a child's level of anxiety and their performance at school. So he's looking to see if there's a relationship. He's not looking to see if anxiety causes poor performance or if poor performance results in anxiety. He's not looking for a cause, just to see if there's a relationship between the two. Two kinds of correlation. Positive correlation, as one variable increases, the other variable increases. In other words, the amount of time a student spends studying correlates to higher grades. As time studying increases, grades go up. Negative correlation is as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. Going back to the previous example, so students with a high level of anxiety will have poor school performance. As their anxiety goes up, their performance goes down. That's a negative correlation. One last thing on research, there's definitely an ethical aspect. I think in some other PowerPoints, we've looked at some examples of experiments that wouldn't be ethical at this point. But you can't just do anything you want with research. For human research, it has to be approved by the Institutional Review Board. Participants must also be given informed consent before the research. Doesn't mean they're told what the experiment is about, they're just told of any risks that might come with the experiment. You can deceive people unless it would be considered harmful, and debriefing is required, in which participants are told the purpose of the study and what the experiment was for. We know a lot of people do animal research. Any experiments done on animals has to be approved by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening, and as always, please let me know if you have any questions.